The first thing Kaelen Voss noticed about the Onyx Spire was that the architecture was breathing. It wasn't the heavy, mechanical rasp of the deep space freighters he usually worked on, but a rhythmic, organic sigh that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his scuffed leather boots. The floor wasn't made of steel or composite. It was a polished, translucent amber-veined stone that felt warm to the touch, almost as if it had a pulse. Kaelen shifted his weight, gripping the worn handle of his heavy-duty tool case. He felt like a grease stain on a silk sheet. In the smog-choked alleys of the lower reaches, where he usually operated, royalty was just a word on the news feeds, and palaces were mythical places where people didn't have to worry about oxygen scrubbers failing in the middle of the night. "Don't gawk, Kaelen," he muttered under his breath, adjusting the strap of his utility vest. "The more expensive the walls, the more likely they are to stiff you on the bill if they think you're a tourist." A pair of Aethelgardian sentinels approached him. They were striking, terrifyingly elegant figures, clad in armor that looked like hardened iridescent scales. Their most striking feature, however, was the Aethel ears. Long, slender appendages that tapered back from their temples, twitching with every infinitesimal sound in the corridor. Their eyes were the color of sun-bleached ice, scanning him with a clinical detachment that made his skin crawl. "Mechanic Kaelen Voss?" one of them asked. The voice wasn't spoken. It was a melodic resonance that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight to his brain. "That's me, unless there's another guy with a toolkit and a bad attitude waiting at the docking bay," Kaelen replied, leaning into his usual defensive sarcasm. The guard didn't blink. Humor, it seemed, was a luxury not included in the palace security package. "You are late. The luminous core is fluctuating. The high artificers have exhausted their neural link protocols. They require a manual intervention." Manual is a polite way of saying you need someone to get their hands dirty because your fancy light computers are having a tantrum, Kaelen said, gesturing for them to lead the way. "I've spent 10 years fixing pulse engines with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. I think I can handle a glowing rock." As they moved deeper into the spire, the air changed. It became rich with the scent of ozone and something sweet, like crushed violets. The geometry of the halls was nonsensical. Walls curved at impossible angles, and holographic interfaces drifted through the air like ghostfish, whispering data in a language that sounded like wind chimes. Kaelen kept his eyes down. He focused on the rhythm of his own footsteps, trying to ignore the sensation that the building was watching him. He had fixed everything from hydropumps to black market warp drives, but this place felt different. It felt familiar. A nagging itch at the back of his mind suggested he knew which way the next corridor turned before they even reached it. "De-icing the brain," he whispered. "Just a side effect of too much cheap synth-caff." They reached the central sanctum, a cavernous hall dominated by a structure that defied gravity. A massive, jagged shard of crystalline light was suspended in the center, pulsing with an uneven, sickly violet hue. Thousands of glass-like filaments radiated from it, connecting to the walls like a massive, glowing nervous system. A group of artificers stood near the base, their long ears flattened against their heads in distress. One of them, an elderly man with skin like wrinkled parchment, looked up as Kaelen approached. "The resonance is fractured," the artificer said, his voice trembling. "We have tried every harmonic sequence. It refuses to stabilize." "It is angry." "It's not angry, Gramps," Kaelen said, setting his tool case down with a heavy clank that made the artificers flinch. "It's flooded. You've been pushing too much neural data into a system that's designed for raw flow. You're overthinking it. Sometimes you just need to clear the pipes." He knelt at the base of the crystal, opening his case. He ignored the gasps of the Aethelgardians as he pulled out a jagged analog frequency tuner, a piece of primitive tech that looked like a relic in this temple of light. He began to work, his fingers moving with a grace he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't thinking, he was feeling the vibration. For an hour, the world narrowed down to the hum of the crystal and the tension in his hands. He bypassed 3 primary logic gates, rerouted the energy through a secondary shunt, and gave the base of the crystal a sharp, calculated tap with the butt of his sensor probe. The violet light flickered, then smoothed into a steady calming gold. The screaming hum in the air subsided into a gentle purr. "Impossible," someone whispered. Kaelen wiped a smudge of grease onto his pants and stood up. "Like I said, overthinking. You guys owe me 5,000 credits plus travel expenses, and I don't take palace vouchers." He turned around, expecting a disgruntled paymaster. Instead, the room had gone deathly silent. The artificers were bowing, their foreheads nearly touching the floor. At the far end of the hall, the great doors had opened. A woman entered, her presence so commanding that it felt as if the room's gravity had shifted toward her. She was dressed in flowing robes of deep midnight blue, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders. Her ethel ears were long and elegant, curving back like the wings of a bird. This was Princess Lyra Solari. Kaelen straightened his vest, feeling suddenly exposed. He wasn't good with people, especially people who owned planets. "Your Highness," the chief artificer stammered, "the core it is stabilized. The human, he fixed it." Lyra didn't look at the core. Her ice blue eyes were fixed entirely on Kaelen. She walked toward him, her movements fluid and silent. As she got closer, Kaelen noticed a strange tremor in her hands. "You," she said. Her voice was thin, brittle. "The mechanic." "Kaelen Voss, at your service," he said, trying for a rakish smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm the guy you call when the magic rocks stop working." The moment the name Kaelen left his lips, the princess stopped. She didn't just stop walking. She seemed to turn to stone. The color drained from her face, leaving her ghost pale. "Kaelen," she whispered. "Voss? Yeah. Is there a problem with the name? Because if it's a religious thing, I can go by V or Hey You," Kaelen said, his internal alarm bell starting to ring. Lyra's eyes widened, filling with a sudden, overwhelming shine. A sharp, broken sob escaped her throat. She covered her mouth with both hands, but it was too late. Tears began to stream down her face, splashing onto her royal robes. She wasn't crying the way a princess was supposed to, delicately and quietly. She was weeping with the raw, agonizing grief of someone who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. The room erupted. Guards rushed forward, artificers began chanting protective sequences, and a medical drone buzzed toward the princess, its lights flashing red. "Whoa, hey!" Kaelen shouted, backing away with his hands raised. "I didn't touch her. I was 10 feet away. I'm a mechanic, not an assassin." "Remain where you are, human," a guard roared, leveling a spear of light at Kaelen's chest. Lyra turned away, her composure completely shattered. She fled the chamber, her attendants trailing after her in a flurry of blue silk and panic. The heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that felt like a prison cell closing. Kaelen stood in the center of the silent sanctum, his tool case still open at his feet. The golden light of the core reflected in his eyes, but all he could see was the look of utter devastation on the princess's face. "Great," he muttered to himself. "First royal contract, and I've already broken the princess." The waiting room they had put Kaelen in was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was a circular chamber with walls made of living moss and shifting fiber optics that displayed a slow-motion simulation of the Aethelgardian sky. There were no corners, no shadows, and absolutely no way to tell where the door had been before it melted back into the wall. Kaelen sat on a levitating bench that kept trying to adjust its density to match his optimal comfort profile. "Stop it," he snapped at the furniture. "I like my chairs hard and unforgiving, just like my life." The bench hummed apologetically and stiffened. Kaelen leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a chaotic mess of, what the hell just happened? And, am I going to get executed? He had been in some tight spots before. Pirate raids on the Outer Rim, engine meltdowns in Sector 7. But those were problems he could solve with a soldering iron. This was different. This was personal, and he didn't even know the person. "Okay, Kaelen," he whispered. "Analyze the data. You fix the machine. The princess walks in. You say your name. She has a total meltdown. Conclusion, either I look exactly like her ex-boyfriend who stood her up at the altar, or I'm the long-lost heir to a galactic toilet cleaning empire." A soft chime echoed through the room. A holographic interface flickered to life in front of him, showing a small spherical drone with a single glowing lens. "Subject Kaelen Voss," the drone chirped. "I am Unit 7 Beta, the palace's hospitality and surveillance interface. Please remain calm. Your biometric signatures indicate an elevated heart rate." "No kidding, Tin Can. I'm being held captive in a botanical garden after making a royal cry," Kaelen said. "Am I under arrest, or is this just a really intense way of waiting for my check?" "Your status is currently undefined," the drone replied. "Princess Lyra has requested a full diagnostic of your identity. We are currently cross-referencing your DNA with the Great Archive of the Pre-Void Era." Kaelen froze. "The Pre-Void Era? That's ancient history. Why would you need to check my DNA for that?" "The princess's reaction suggests a historical resonance," the drone said neutrally. "Would you like a beverage? We have nutrient-enriched nectar or water filtered through the roots of the world tree." "I'd like a whiskey and a way out of here, but I'll settle for the water," Kaelen sighed. As he waited, a strange sensation began to wash over him. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A low-frequency vibration that seemed to be calling to him from the walls. He stood up and walked over to the moss-covered surface. He placed his hand on a patch of glowing blue lichen. The moment his skin touched the wall, a flash of white light scorched his vision. He saw a girl. She was younger, her silver hair tied back with a strand of glowing wire. She was laughing, holding a clumsy-looking device that was sparking with blue electricity. "It's going to blow up, Kaelen," she shouted, her ethel ears twitching with excitement. "It's not going to blow up, Lyra. It's going to fly. It's a sky kite," a boy's voice replied, a voice that sounded hauntingly like his own. Kaelen jerked his hand away, gasping for air. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "What was that?" he demanded, staring at his palm. "Did you just shock me?" "I detected no electrical discharge," the drone replied. "Are you experiencing sensory hallucinations?" I don't know," Kaelen stammered. "I saw something, a memory, but it wasn't mine. I grew up on the junkyard moons of Xylos. I didn't have sky kites. I had rusted scrap metal and oxygen rations." The door to the chamber suddenly irised open. A tall, stern-looking official entered, followed by 4 armed sentinels. He held a data slab that was glowing with an intense golden light. "Mechanic Voss," the official said, his voice cold. "Follow us. The High Council has reached a verdict regarding your presence." "Let me guess," Kaelen said, regaining some of his bravado. "I'm being banned for life from all royal functions?" "On the contrary," the official said, his eyes narrowing. "You are being moved to the royal suites. Princess Lyra has issued a direct decree. You are to be given every resource of the Spire until your true origin is confirmed." Kaelen looked at the guards, then back at the drone. "The royal suites? Does that come with a private bathroom? Because the ones in the lower reaches are basically buckets." "This is not a joke, human," the official snapped. "The palace intelligence has found a match. Your DNA is 99% identical to a missing asset from 30 years ago. An asset that was supposed to have perished during the fall of the old core." Kaelen felt a cold shiver run down his spine. 30 years? I'm 32. I don't remember any fall. I don't remember anything before I was 6 years old. My files say I was a refugee from the Xylos border wars. "Files can be rewritten," the official said, stepping aside to let Kaelen through. "Memories can be suppressed, but the blood always remembers the hum of the machine." As Kaelen walked through the palace, he noticed that the building was changing again. The walls were no longer green. They were turning a deep, vibrant gold, the same color as the stabilized core. The floor seemed to rise slightly to meet his footsteps, making his walk feel effortless. He realized with a jolt of terror that the palace wasn't just accommodating him, it was welcoming him home. They reached a massive set of double doors carved from a single piece of obsidian. The official bowed and stepped back. The doors opened slowly, revealing a room that was filled with thousands of floating shards of crystal, records, images, and data streams from another life. In the center of the room stood Lyra. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She was holding a small charred object in her hand, a piece of blackened metal that looked like a fragment of a child's toy. "You called it a sky kite," she said softly, not looking up. "You told me that if we used the luminous weave instead of batteries, it would reach the stars. Kaelen walked toward her, his boots feeling heavy. I don't remember that. I'm just a guy who fixes things for credits, Princess. I think you've got the wrong mechanic. She finally looked at him, and for the first time, Kaelen saw not a princess, but a woman who had been waiting for a miracle for a long, long time. The system doesn't lie, Kaelen, she said, her voice growing stronger. You fix the core not because you are a good mechanic, but because you are the core. You designed it, you built it, and then you were taken to save us all. She held out the charred toy. Take it. Tell me what you feel. Kaelen hesitated, his hand trembling. He reached out and touched the cold, dead metal. The world didn't just flicker this time. It exploded. The smell of smoke, the sound of sirens, a hand pulling him away, a girl's voice screaming his name as the sky turned the color of blood. Don't let them take him! Kaelen dropped the toy as if it were white hot. He staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What did you do to me? He hissed. What is this? It's the truth emerging, Lyra said, stepping closer, her Ethel ears twitching with a mixture of hope and sorrow. And the truth is, Kaelen Voss, that Aethelgard is dying, and you are the only one who can remember how to save it. Kaelen looked at his hands that had spent years covered in oil and grime, hands that he thought were only good for tightening bolts. I'm just a mechanic, he whispered. But even as he said it, he could feel the pulse of the palace beneath his feet, syncopated with the rhythm of his own heart. The hum was no longer outside, it was inside him. The royal suites were not just a place to sleep, they were a living archive of a civilization that had forgotten how to function without its architect. Kaelen Voss spent the first 3 hours of his promotion pacing the length of the obsidian-floored study. Every time he stopped, the floor glowed brighter, as if the palace were leaning in to catch a whispered secret. He felt like a bug under a microscope, or worse, a sacred relic being dusted off for a ceremony he didn't want to attend. Can't even get a decent cup of synth calf in this joint, Kaelen muttered, kicking a low-slung table made of hardened starlight. It didn't move. It didn't even vibrate. Everything's so pristine it makes me want to spit on the floor just to see if the moss cleans it up. It would, a voice said from the archway. Lyra stood there, silhouetted against the golden glow of the corridor. She had changed into less formal attire, a tunic of woven glass fiber that shimmered like the surface of a lake at dusk. She looked less like a figurehead and more like the girl from his fractured vision, though the weight in her eyes was undeniably that of a woman who had seen a world break. The palace systems are highly efficient at waste management, Kaelen, she continued, stepping into the room. But I suspect you're more interested in the waste of your own history than the cleanliness of my floors. Look, Princess, Kaelen said, rubbing the back of his neck where a dull ache had begun to throb. I'm having a real hard time with the destiny talk. One day I'm dodging debt collectors on a transit station. The next I'm the long-lost savior of a planet that grows its own light bulbs. It's a bit much for a Tuesday. Lyra walked over to a central pedestal and tapped a sequence into the air. A holographic projection bloomed, thousands of lines of code and geometric schematics swirling like a digital blizzard. This is the luminous core's original architecture, she said. Look at the logic gates. Look at the way the energy shunts are organized. Kaelen squinted at the blue light. At first it looked like a mess of alien gibberish, but as he stared, his eyes began to track patterns. He saw inefficiencies in the flow that made him wince. He saw a specific, recursive loop in the third-tier cooling system that was so elegant it made his throat feel tight. That's a mess, Kaelen blurted out, pointing to a junction. Why would anyone route the biocurrent through the primary lattice like that? It's begging for a feedback loop. You've got to offset the pressure with a manual override, or the whole thing's going to blow a gasket every 50 years. Lyra's ears twitched with a sharp, sudden motion, a sign of intense emotion he was beginning to recognize. That is exactly what you said when you were 12 years old. My father's engineers called you a brash human child. You told them their reactors were cowards because they were too afraid of the heat. Kaelen felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. I was a mouthy kid. Doesn't mean I'm the guy. The manual override you just mentioned? Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. It's what you were doing when the disaster happened. You were trying to save the city while the rest of us were being evacuated to the bunkers. Kaelen looked back at the schematics. He felt a phantom heat on his face, the smell of ozone so thick he could taste it. Why would they wipe my head? If I was so important, why toss me out with the trash? Because the war wasn't just about resources, Kaelen, Lyra said, moving closer until he could see the fine, luminous texture of her skin. It was about ideology. The opposition saw your gift, the ability to bridge human intuition with Aethelgardian technology, as a threat to our purity. To save your life, my father had to make you disappear. He brokered a deal with the human accord. Your memories were suppressed, your identity erased, and you were placed in the refugee streams. It was the only way to keep the assassins from finding you. So he turned me into a ghost to keep me breathing, Kaelen said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. Real noble. Did he ever ask me if I wanted to spend 30 years wondering why I didn't fit in anywhere? He didn't have a choice, she said. There's always a choice, princess. Usually it's just a matter of who's willing to pay the tab. He turned away from her, his hands balled into fists. He had spent his whole life feeling like a piece of machinery that had been put together wrong. Every job he took, every station he stayed on, he was always the outsider, the guy who could hear the wrongness in a ship's engine before the sensors even picked it up. Now he knew why. He was a master key that had been filed down until it didn't recognize its own lock. The council is meeting tomorrow, Lyra said after a long silence. They're terrified. The core is stable for now, but the biodecay is spreading. They want to know if you can fix it permanently. They want to know if the architect has truly returned. Tell him the architect is KIA, Kaelen snapped. I'm just a grease monkey. I can patch your leaks and stop the humming, but I can't rebuild a dying world from memory. I don't even remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago. We have a way to help with that, Lyra said. The synaptic resonator. It uses the same crystalline frequency as the core. It can bypass the neural suppression blocks. Brain scrubbing? No thanks. I've seen what happens to guys who mess with their gray matter in the low reaches. They end up drooling in a corner, thinking they're a toaster. It's not scrubbing, she countered, her ice blue eyes flashing with frustration. It's a resonance. It doesn't force anything. It just invites the truth to come home. Please, Kaelen, not for the council. For me, I've spent 20 years talking to a machine you built, hoping I'd hear your voice in the hum. I don't want to talk to a ghost anymore. Kaelen looked at her, and for a second, the sarcastic armor he wore so thick felt like it was made of paper. He saw the loneliness in her, a mirror of his own. She was a princess in a palace of light, but she was just as trapped as he had been in the smog of Xylos. I make no promises, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low growl. But I'll look at the machine. If it starts trying to reprogram my personality, I'm out of here. I don't care how many light spears your guards have. That is all I ask, Lyra said, a faint, genuine smile ghosting her lips. As she left, Kaelen turned back to the window. Below him, the city of Onyx Spire stretched out like a glowing coral reef. It was beautiful, alien, and completely broken. Well, Kaelen, he whispered to his reflection in the glass, time to see if there's anything left of you under all that rust. The night didn't bring sleep. Every time Kaelen closed his eyes, he heard the sound of wind chimes and the smell of ozone. He saw the girl with the silver hair. He felt the weight of a heavy wrench in a hand that was much too small. He got up and wandered the suite. He found a small hidden alcove behind a curtain of weeping willow fibers. Inside was a workbench, untouched for decades. It was covered in a layer of fine, translucent dust. Kaelen reached out and ran his finger along the surface. Under the dust was a series of scratches. They weren't Aethelgardian runes. They were human letters, crude, jagged, and defiant. HFY was here. Kaelen felt a jolt of electricity shoot up his arm. He gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't just a ghost in this palace. He was the foundation. All right, Aethelgard, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Let's see what you're hiding. The chamber of the synaptic resonator looked less like a laboratory and more like the inside of a massive frozen eye. Thousands of razor-thin crystal needles hung from the ceiling, all pointing toward a central dais made of pulsating violet quartz. The air was so still it felt heavy, thick with the static charge of suppressed memories waiting to be unleashed. Kaelen Voss stood at the entrance, his tool case held tightly in his hand like a shield. He had insisted on bringing it. It was the only thing in this entire planet that made sense to him. Tangible, heavy, and honest. "You look like you're heading to a firing squad," a voice remarked. It was Jackson, the chief artificer Kaelen had met during the core repair. The old man was hovering near a bank of light interfaces, his long ears twitching in a rhythmic pattern that Kaelen suspected was a sign of anxiety. "I've had worse mornings," Kaelen lied, stepping onto the polished floor. "Once got stuck in a trash compactor on a mining colony. At least this room smells like flowers instead of rotting protein paste." "The process is not painful, Master Voss," Jackson said, though he didn't use the word master with any sarcasm this time. There was a genuine, terrifying respect in his voice. "It is a harmonic alignment. Your neural pathways were intentionally dampened, like a string on an instrument that has been muffled with cloth. We are simply removing the cloth." "Yeah, and sometimes when you remove the cloth, the string snaps," Kaelen retorted. He looked at Lyra, who was standing by the observation window. She looked pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Are we doing this or what? I've got a busy schedule of sitting in fancy chairs and being confused." "Please, lie on the dais," Jackson instructed. Kaelen climbed onto the quartz platform. It was cold at first, but as soon as he lay back, it began to vibrate, a low-frequency thrum that resonated in his teeth. The crystal needles above him began to descend, glowing with a soft, pale blue light. "Initiating resonance," Jackson announced. The world didn't fade to black. It exploded into color. At first, it was a cacophony of sensory data. Kaelen felt the biting cold of xylose, the taste of metallic water, the sound of his first boss yelling at him for stripping a bolt. These were his memories, the life of a scavenger, a drifter, a man with no home. Then the vibration changed. It hit a frequency that made Kalen's entire body tingle. A door opened. Not a door in the room, but a door in his mind. He was standing in a field of tall, amber grass. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, two moons hanging like pale coins in the distance. Beside him stood a man with a kind face and eyes like Lyra's. The king. "You see the flow, Kaelen?" the king asked, pointing to a river of glowing liquid that wound through the valley. "The others see power. They see a resource. But you see the song." "It's not a song, sir," the boy Kaelen replied, his voice high and confident. "It's a circuit, but the resistance is too high in the northern bend. If we don't widen the channel, the whole valley's going to choke by harvest time." The king laughed, a warm, booming sound. "A human child lecturing the crown on fluid dynamics. My daughter was right about you. You're a miracle we don't deserve." The memory shifted violently. Fire. Black smoke blotting out the violet sky. The sound of screaming. Not human screaming, but the high-pitched shriek of dying machines. Kaelen was running through a corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was holding a heavy metal canister, his small arms shaking under the weight. "Kaelen, move!" a voice screamed. It was Lyra. She was covered in soot, her robes torn. "I have to lock the secondary shunt," he yelled back. "If the pressure builds, the spire will collapse. Go to the transport. I'll be right behind you." "You're coming now!" She grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. "I'm the only one who knows the code, Lyra. Run!" He pushed her toward a waiting evacuation pod. He saw her face through the closing glass, her mouth moving in a silent scream. Then the ceiling collapsed. Kaelen bolted upright on the dais, a strangled cry escaping his throat. The crystal needles retracted instantly, the blue light fading to a dull gray. He was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if he had actually been running through those burning halls. "Kaelen!" Lyra was by his side in an instant, her hands on his shoulders. "Kaelen, breathe. You're here. You're in the spire. It's been 30 years. Kaelen looked at her, but he didn't see the princess. He saw the soot-stained girl in the evacuation pod. He saw the look of utter betrayal when he had stayed behind. I didn't make it to the pod," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "I stayed to lock the shunt. I thought I could fix it. I thought I was smart enough to stop a war with a wrench. You did stop it, Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. The explosion was contained because of your actions. You saved the Onyx Spire and every living soul within 500 kilometers of it. But the feedback loop, it caught you. We found you in the wreckage, barely alive. Your mind was shattered by the neural backsurge. Kaelen rubbed his eyes, his mind reeling. So the memory wipe. It wasn't just to hide me. It was to save what was left of my brain. Yes, Lyra said, her voice a pained whisper. You were in a coma for months. When you finally woke up, you didn't know your name. You didn't know me. The doctors said the only way to prevent permanent brain death was to suppress the trauma, to let your mind build a new identity from scratch. My father, he couldn't keep you here. The faction that started the war was still looking for the human weapon. He sent you away to keep you alive, even if it meant you would never know who you were. Kaelen slumped back against the dais. The weight of it was crushing. Every struggle he'd had, every lonely night on a cold station, every time he'd felt like a failure, it was all based on a lie designed to protect him. He wasn't a drifter. He was a hero who had been discarded for his own safety. I remember the code, Kaelen said suddenly, his eyes snapping open. What? Jackson leaned in, his ears perking up. The secondary shunt. The reason the core is failing now. I didn't just lock it, I encrypted it. I was a 12-year-old kid who didn't trust anyone else to touch my work. I put a dead man switch on the biolattice. He stood up, his legs shaky but his gaze fixed. He walked over to his tool case and pulled out a small battered sensor probe. The core isn't just dying of old age, Kaelen said, the sharp analytical tone of the architect beginning to bleed into his voice. It's waiting. It's been waiting 30 years for me to finish the sequence. And if I don't do it soon, the encryption is going to collapse, and the feedback loop I stopped back then, it's going to finish what it started. How long? Lyra asked, her face set in a mask of royal resolve. Based on the fluctuations I saw earlier, we've got maybe 48 hours before the whole spire goes up like a supernova. And I'm guessing the council isn't going to like my solution? What is your solution? Jackson asked. Kaelen looked at the old artificer, a grim smile playing on his lips. We have to take the core offline. Completely. We have to kill the power to the entire planet for at least 6 hours while I manually recut the crystalline tracks. 6 hours of darkness? Jackson gasped. The life support systems, the atmosphere scrubbers, the bioshielding. Millions would be at risk. If we don't, Kaelen said, his voice cold and certain, everyone dies in 48. Those are the numbers, and numbers don't give a damn about your traditions or your comfort. He looked at Lyra. You wanted the architect back, Princess? Well, he's back, and he's telling you that the only way to save your world is to turn it off and see if it's got the heart to start up again. The silence in the room was absolute. Lyra looked at Kaelen, seeing the man he had become, the gritty, sarcastic survivor, intertwined with the brilliant, stubborn boy she had loved. I will speak to the council, she said, her voice echoing with the weight of her crown. But Kaelen, if this fails, there will be no refugee ship this time. There will be nothing left but ash. I know, Kaelen said, picking up his tool case, but I've spent 30 years being ash. I think it's time I tried being a spark again. As he walked out of the chamber, his boots clicked on the floor with a new rhythm. It wasn't the tentative step of a stranger. It was the heavy, confident stride of a man who knew exactly where the pipes led and exactly how hard he had to hit them to make them sing. He had spent his life fixing broken things because he felt broken himself. Now he realized that the brokenness wasn't a flaw. It was a preparation. Every stripped bolt, every jury-rigged engine, every desperate repair on a failing station. It had all been training for this. He wasn't just fixing a machine. He was reclaiming a purpose. And as he passed a golden wall, he saw his reflection. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired, dirty, and a little bit dangerous. 48 hours, he muttered, checking his watch. Better find some better coffee. It's going to be a long night. The theme was no longer a seed. It was a root digging deep into the soil of his identity. He had found his purpose, but the cost was going to be higher than anything he had ever imagined. Because to save Aethelgard, he would have to face the one thing he feared more than death, the memory of the boy who had tried to be a god, and the man who realized he was only a mechanic. The council chamber of Aethelgard was a cathedral of light designed to make any individual feel like an insignificant speck of dust. The high elders sat upon floating platforms of polished obsidian, their long ears draped in silken sleeves, their eyes cold and unblinking. Below them, Kaelen Voss stood in the center of the floor, his grease-stained utility vest a jarring contrast to the opulence of the room. He felt like a stray dog in a jewelry store, and he was pretty sure most of the people on those platforms wanted to have him put down. "You are asking us to plunge this world into the great dark," Elder Vaughn spoke, his voice echoing like a tolling bell. "For 6 hours, the life support of 3 billion souls will rely on residual atmospheric pressure. The bioshields protecting us from the radiation of the binary suns will cease. You are a human mechanic with a fractured mind. Why should we gamble the survival of Aethelgard on your gut feeling?" Kaelen shifted his weight, his boots squeaking on the floor. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a fancy holographic presentation. All he had was a wrench in his pocket and a burning certainty in his chest. "Look, I get it," Kaelen said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. "I'm a smooth ear with a toolkit. To you, I'm a glitch in the system. But that core? It's not just a machine to me. It's a debt. I'm the guy who put the lock on it, and I'm the only guy with the key. You talk about gambling with lives? You're already doing that. Every minute you sit here debating my resume, the biolattice is rotting. In 48 hours, you won't have a great dark. You'll have a great silence. Permanently. We could simply purge the manual shunts and let the artificers rebuild the code," a younger counselor suggested, her voice dripping with disdain. Kaelen laughed, a short, sharp sound that startled the room. "Purge the shunts? Lady, if you touch those shunts without the proper sequence, the feedback loop will turn this spire into a crater before you can blink. You want to play it safe? Safe is what got you here. Safe is why you've been ignoring the decay for 30 years, hoping it would just fix itself." Lyra stepped forward from her place beside the throne. She didn't look at the council. She looked at Kaelen. "The architect has returned," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not as a boy and not as a god. He has returned as a man who knows the cost of survival. I trust him with my life. I trust him with our world." "Sentiment is not policy, Princess," Vaughn hissed. "It's not sentiment," Lyra countered. "It's recognition. The palace intelligence has already verified his DNA. The systems are responding to him in ways they haven't responded to anyone in 3 decades. If we deny him, we are not being cautious. We are being suicidal." The council descended into a flurry of whispered arguments. Kaelen watched them, feeling a strange sense of detachment. He realized that even if they said no, he was going to do it anyway. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't a purpose that required permission. "Fine," Vaughn finally said, the words sounding like it was being pulled out of him with pliers. "You have 6 hours. But hear this, Kaelen Voss. If the lights do not come back on, you will not live to see the dawn. We will ensure your exit is as final as the one you've planned for our world." Yeah, Kaelen muttered, turning toward the exit. "Add it to the bill. Let's get to work." The preparation was a nightmare of logistics. Kaelen had to coordinate with thousands of local engineers who spoke in equations and looked at him like he was a caveman trying to fix a spaceship. He spent the next 12 hours in the bowels of the Onyx Spire, surrounded by pulsing biovines and crystalline conduits that hummed with a nervous energy. "Listen up," Kaelen shouted to a group of nervous-looking artificers. "I don't care about your harmonic resonance right now. I need you to bypass the tertiary filters and prepare for a hard reset. When the lights go out, I need every one of you on a manual pump. If the nutrient flow stops for more than 10 minutes, the crystalline structures will start to calcify, and then we're all screwed. Got it?" "But the manual pumps are archaic," one of the engineers stammered. "They haven't been touched in 40 years. "Then find some lubricant and start cranking," Kaelen snapped. "This isn't a gala, it's a bug out. Move!" As the deadline approached, the air in the spire became heavy with tension. People were retreating to the lower bunkers, clutching their belongings and praying to stars they hadn't seen in centuries. Kaelen found himself back at the base of the luminous core, his tool case open, his hands shaking slightly. Lyra appeared beside him. She looked exhausted, her silver hair loose and messy. "The evacuation is complete," she said. "The city is as ready as it can be." "You should be in the bunker, Princess," Kaelen said, not looking up from his diagnostic slab. "A captain stays with her ship, Kaelen, and a friend stays with the guy who's about to save her life. Again." Kaelen stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Lyra, I need to tell you something. Before the lights go out, those memories, the ones that came back, they weren't just about machines. I remember you. I remember how you used to cheat at that board game with the glowing marbles. I remember how you hated the taste of the blue nectar, but drank it anyway to be polite to the king." Lyra's ears twitched, a soft, fluttering motion. "I still hate it," she whispered. "I spent 30 years thinking I was nobody," Kaelen said, his voice low. "And maybe that was a gift. It taught me that it doesn't matter who you were supposed to be. All that matters is what you do when the wrench is in your hand and the clock is ticking. I'm scared, Lyra. Not of dying. I'm scared of failing you twice." "You didn't fail me the first time," she said, stepping closer and placing a hand on his arm. "You gave me 30 years of peace. Now give me a future." Kaelen nodded, a grim determination settling over him. He reached out and touched the primary control node. It was warm, pulsing like a living heart. "All right, Aethelgard," he whispered. "Let's see if you've still got some fight in you." He punched in the final sequence. The sound was the worst part. It wasn't a bang. It was a long, descending groan, like a giant taking its final breath. The golden light of the core flickered, turned a deep, bruised purple, and then vanished. The darkness was absolute. Kaelen's head throbbed as the neural link was severed. For a moment he was blind and deaf, drowning in a void that felt far too much like the 30 years he had lost. Then his emergency lamp flickered on, casting a small, weak circle of white light against the obsidian walls. "Phase 1 complete," Kaelen panted into his comlink. "We're in the dark. Start the manual pumps. And for the love of all things shiny, don't stop cranking." The first hour of the Great Dark was manageable. The second hour was a descent into madness. Kaelen was deep inside the core's primary maintenance shaft, a space so narrow he had to crawl on his stomach. The air was already getting thin, and the smell of ozone had been replaced by the damp, earthy scent of dying biomatter. He could hear the faint, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the manual pumps in the distance, a desperate heartbeat for a dying world. "Talk to me, Lyra," Kaelen whispered into his headset. "Tell me the city hasn't started eating itself yet." "It's quiet, Kaelen." Her voice came back, crackling through the static. "Too quiet. The temperature is dropping faster than we anticipated. The gardens are beginning to frost, but the people are holding. They're huddling together in the squares. They're sharing heat packs and telling stories. It's strange. For the first time in my life, Aethelgard feels like a community instead of just a machine." "Glad somebody's having a good time," Kaelen grunted, struggling to loosen a calcified crystal bolt. "I'm currently being hugged by a wall that's trying to go into rigor mortis. This thing is tougher than I thought." "You can do it, Kaelen. Remember the sky kite. You always said that if it didn't work the first time, you just hadn't used enough force." Kaelen managed to crack the bolt, a sharp snap echoing in the confined space. "Yeah, well, force is all I've got left. My sensors are blind down here. I'm working on feel alone." That was the point where the humanistic theme was tested to its breaking point. As Kaelen worked, his mind began to drift. Without the distractions of light and noise, the memories he had suppressed started to bubble up like black ink in a pool of water. He saw the faces of the people he had worked with on the transit stations, the rough, tired men and women who had shared their meager rations with him. He saw the kids who had looked up to him because he could make a broken toy spin for 5 more minutes. He realized then that the great architect wasn't the hero. The hero was the man who had survived the dirt and the grease. If he had stayed on Aethelgard, he would have been a pampered genius, disconnected from the reality of struggle. His 30 years in the trash hadn't been a waste. They had been his education. They had taught him that life wasn't about elegant equations. It was about the stubborn refusal to give up when everything was cold and dark. Suddenly, the floor beneath him buckled. A massive, crystalline conduit, deprived of its stabilizing heat, had fractured. A spray of freezing biocoolant hit Kaelen in the face, blinding him. "Kaelen, what happened?" Lyra's voice was panicked. Pressure spike! Kaelen shouted, wiping his eyes with a greasy sleeve. The tertiary shunt just blew. I'm getting flooded down here. Get out! Kaelen, the sensors say that sector is collapsing. Get out now! I can't! Kaelen roared, his voice echoing in the tunnel. If I don't patch this leak, the reset sequence will fail. The core won't be able to draw enough pressure to restart. I have to hold it. He lunged forward, his hands submerged in the freezing blue liquid. It felt like 1,000 needles were stabbing his skin. He found the fracture, a jagged tear in the biofiber. He reached into his toolkit and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty industrial sealant, stuff he'd bought from a black market dealer on a space wharf 3 light-years away. Come on, you piece of junk, Kaelen hissed, wrapping the tape around the conduit with frantic speed. Don't you dare fail me now. I didn't survive 30 years of bad coffee and orbital strikes to be drowned by a glorified radiator. The coolant was rising, reaching his chest. It was so cold he could barely breathe. His fingers were becoming numb, losing their grip on the slippery tape. Kaelen, please, Lyra was crying now. The council is demanding we abort. They want to try the purge. They say you're dead. Tell the council to kiss my analog ass, Kaelen gasped. He gave the sealant one final desperate tug, bracing his boots against the opposite wall. The flow slowed, then stopped. He slumped back against the wall, shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. Leak. Patched, he wheezed, restarting the countdown. Give me 5 minutes. Kaelen, stay with me, Lyra pleaded. Don't close your eyes. Talk to me. Tell me about the stations. Tell me about the people you met. They were like us, Kaelen whispered, his voice fading. Scared, stubborn, just trying to fix what's broken. We're all just mechanics, Lyra, trying to keep the lights on for one more day. The 5th hour passed in a blur of hypothermia and exhaustion. Kaelen crawled back toward the main hub, his movements slow and agonizing. He reached the primary override terminal just as his emergency lamp died, plunging him back into the absolute dark. He didn't need light. He knew the layout by heart now, not because of the memories of the boy, but because of the sweat of the man. He felt for the buttons, his fingers finding the familiar shapes. Lyra, he croaked, it's time. Tell everyone to brace. When I hit this, it's either going to be a new day or a very bright funeral. We're ready, Kaelen. We're all here. Together. Kaelen closed his eyes. He thought of the girl with the silver hair. He thought of the man with the kind face. And then he thought of the millions of people in the dark, waiting for a spark. He slammed his fist onto the restart sequence. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was crushing his lungs. Then deep beneath him, a low vibration began. It wasn't a groan this time. It was a hum, a steady, confident, golden hum. A single spark of light appeared in the center of the room, then another and another. The violet rot was being burned away by a surge of pure golden energy. The light raced through the conduits, spreading like wildfire through the spire. Kaelen, it's working. The lights are coming back. The sensors are green. The core is stable. Lyra's voice was a scream of pure joy. Kaelen didn't answer. He slumped against the terminal, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. He could feel the warmth returning to the walls. He could feel the palace breathing again, not as a machine, but as a living thing. He had done it. He had fixed the world. But as the light filled the room, Kaelen realized something. The cost of the lesson was finally becoming clear. He had reclaimed his purpose, but in doing so, he had destroyed the wall between his 2 lives. He was no longer just the mechanic, and he was no longer just the architect. He was something new, something that Aethelgard wasn't prepared for. The doors to the chamber burst open, and a team of medics rushed in, followed by Lyra. She ran to him, falling to her knees and pulling him into her arms. You're alive, she sobbed, clutching him. You're alive. Kaelen looked up at her, his eyes clouded with exhaustion and something deeper, a wisdom that only comes from the dark. Yeah, he whispered, but the bill's going to be huge, princess. The council would be waiting. The politics would return. The world was saved, but the man who saved it was forever changed. He had learned that a purpose isn't something you find in a history book or a DNA test. It's something you forge in the darkness, with nothing but a wrench and the refusal to let the lights go out. As he was carried out on a stretcher, Kaelen looked at the golden walls of the Onyx Spire. They were beautiful, but he found himself missing the grid of the transit stations. He realized that he didn't belong to the past, and he didn't belong to the palace. He belonged to the work. "Hey, Lyra," he called out, his voice a bit stronger. "Yes, Kaelen? Next time the planet breaks, remind me to charge double for overtime." She laughed, a sound that was more beautiful than any golden light. And for the first time in 30 years, Kaelen Voss felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The celebration was a hollow thing, draped in silk and lit by the stolen glow of a star. In the 3 days following the restoration of the luminous core, Aethelgard had transformed from a tomb of shadows into a carnival of light. Every fountain in the Onyx Spire ran with iridescent liquid, and the air hummed with a harmony so perfect it felt synthetic. But for Kaelen Voss, the music was too loud and the air too thin. He stood on a private balcony overlooking the grand atrium, dressed in a ceremonial tunic that felt like a straitjacket. It was woven from moon moth silk, shifting from silver to deep cobalt with every breath he took. He hated it. He missed the weight of his utility vest. He missed the smell of burnt insulation that usually clung to his hair like a familiar ghost. "You look like a man waiting for a death sentence," a voice remarked. Kaelen didn't turn. He knew the cadence of those footsteps. "I've had more fun in a decontamination shower, Lyra. This whole savior of the planet bit? It's a lot of window dressing for a guy who just turned a key in a lock." Lyra joined him at the railing, her own robes shimmering with a quiet intensity. Her long ears were still, angled back in a posture of reflection. "You didn't just turn a key. You walked into the dark when everyone else was running for the bunkers. That has a way of making people uncomfortable, Kaelen, especially the people who were supposed to be leading." "The council," Kaelen grunted. "I saw Vaughn earlier. He looked like he'd swallowed a piece of bad circuitry. What's the word from the high and mighties?" "The word is that they are grateful," Lyra said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But they are also terrified. You didn't just fix the machine, you rewrote the core logic. You bypassed protocols that have existed for 1,000 years. To the council, you aren't just a mechanic anymore. You're a variable they can't control." "Good," Kaelen said, leaning his elbows on the cold stone. "Control is what got this place into a tailspin. They were so busy worshiping the blueprint, they forgot how to maintain the building. I'm just the guy who noticed the cracks." "It's more than that, Kaelen," she whispered, her hand brushing against his sleeve. "They're moving to vote on your status tomorrow. There are two factions. One wants to name you the Grand Artificer, to keep you here, encased in golden tradition, so you can never leave. The other wants to pay your fee and send you back to the refugee streams. They want to bury the human architect before you disrupt their hierarchy any further." Kaelen laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "So I'm either a trophy or a secret. Story of my life. I'm starting to think my 30 years of being a nobody were the only time I was actually free." "What do you want, Kaelen?" Lyra asked, her ice blue eyes searching his face. "I want a burger that isn't made of algae and a ship that doesn't talk back to me," Kaelen said. But the joke fell flat. He looked out at the city, at the millions of lives pulsing below him. He saw the beauty of it, but he also saw the fragility. Aethelgard was a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece that had forgotten how to bleed. "I don't know, Lyra. I remember the boy who loved this place. I remember the kid who wanted to build a kite that could touch the moons. But that kid died in the fire. The guy standing here? He doesn't know how to be a grand anything." The moment was interrupted by a low, dissonant vibration that shook the balcony. It wasn't the steady hum of the core. It was a jagged, angry sound, like a saw blade cutting through glass. Kaelen's instincts screamed. "That's a subharmonic breach," he snapped, his posture shifting from bored to lethal in a heartbeat. "Someone's messing with the secondary shunts." "Impossible," Lyra said, her ears twitching violently. "The sector is guarded by the elite sentinels." "Guards can be bought, Lyra, but physics is honest." Kaelen didn't wait for permission. He vaulted over the railing, dropping 10 meters to the lower tier, with a grace that came from years of jumping between moving cargo pods. He hit the ground rolling, his ceremonial tunic tearing at the shoulder. He didn't care. He was already running toward the maintenance lift, his mind mapping the palace's nervous system. He reached the access hub for the southwest pylon and found the door had been melted shut. Not hacked, but physically fused. "Damn it," he hissed, reaching into his pocket. He didn't have his toolkit, only a small emergency multi-tool he'd hidden in his waistband. "Hey, Tin Can!" he shouted at a nearby security drone. "Give me a high-frequency override now." "Authorization required," the drone droned. "Code Alpha 919er. Override by the architect," Kaelen roared. The drone's lights flickered from blue to a startled orange. The door hissed open. Inside, the scene was chaos. 3 figures in dark tactical gear were kneeling over a primary energy node, their hands buried in the biolattice. They were wielding pulse cutters, tools designed to sever connections permanently. "Hey, greaseballs!" Kaelen shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. "That's royal property you're chewing on. I suggest you back off before I lose my temper." The saboteurs turned. They weren't Aethelgardians. They were humans, mercenaries from the Outer Rim, their faces covered by breathing masks. "Voss!" one of them rasped, his voice modulated. "The council said you'd be a problem. We're here to ensure the status quo remains static." "The council sent you?" Kaelen's heart sank. He hadn't expected them to move this fast. "To break the world I just fixed? That's a new level of stupid, even for politicians. Honor." "They don't want it broken," the mercenary said, raising a pulse pistol. "They just want it vulnerable. A planet that needs a savior is a planet that stays in line. You did your job too well, kid. You made them obsolete." "I hate politics," Kaelen muttered. "It always messes with the hardware." The first shot missed his head by an inch, scorching the wall behind him. Kaelen dove behind a cooling column, his mind racing. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and dressed for a wedding. But he had something they didn't. He knew every bolt and every wire in this room. He reached up and grabbed a dangling biovine, its surface slick with nutrient sap. With a sharp tug, he ripped it from its housing. A spray of high-pressure fluid erupted, filling the room with a thick, blinding fog. "Where is he?" one of the mercs shouted, his voice muffled by the mist. "I'm the guy who knows where the lights are." Kaelen's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. He used the fog to move, silent as a shadow. He reached the primary environmental controls and punched in a series of commands. The gravity in the room suddenly shifted, tilting 45 degrees to the left. The mercenaries, caught off guard, stumbled and slid across the floor. Kaelen, used to the shifting grav plates of mining ships, didn't lose his footing. He lunged at the nearest man, slamming his elbow into the mercenary's throat and stripping the pistol from his hand. "2 light years for a job and you can't even stand up?" Kaelen mocked, firing a stun bolt into the second man's chest. The third mercenary, the leader, had braced himself against the energy node. He raised his pulse cutter, aiming it not at Kaelen, but at the delicate crystalline core of the pylon. "Don't do it," Kaelen shouted, his voice cracking. "If you sever that connection, the feedback will kill everyone in this wing." "Orders are orders," the man growled. Kaelen had a choice. He could shoot the man, but the pulse cutter would still fall, its blade active. Or he could intercept the blade himself. The humanistic theme he had been grappling with, the idea that his purpose was defined by his willingness to suffer for the whole, slammed into him. He wasn't the architect of light, he was the mechanic of the dark. And a mechanic never lets the machine break. Kaelen lunged. He didn't use the gun. He used his body. He tackled the mercenary just as the pulse cutter descended. The blade didn't hit the core. It hit Kaelen's left arm, the searing heat of the plasma cutting through silk and skin with terrifying ease. Kaelen screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. But he didn't let go. He pinned the man to the ground, his teeth gritted, his vision swimming in a sea of red. "Lyra," he wheezed into his comlink. "Security, southwest pylon. Hurry." The doors burst open. Lyra was the first one through, followed by a squad of loyal sentinels. She saw the mercenaries. She saw the fog, and then she saw Kaelen, slumped against the energy node, his left arm a charred ruin. Kaelen! She shrieked, falling to her knees beside him. I fixed it, Kaelen whispered, a ghost of a smile on his pale lips. Again, someone really needs to fire the council. As the medics rushed in, Kaelen felt the world beginning to fade. He looked at Lyra, her face a mask of horror and love. He realized that the transformation was complete. He wasn't the boy who dreamed of the stars, and he wasn't the man who hid in the grease. He was the bridge, and bridges always get walked on. The recovery wing of the Onyx Spire was a place of sterile beauty and oppressive silence. Kaelen Voss lay in a bed of liquid gel, his left arm encased in a bioregenerative sleeve that pulsed with a rhythmic, cool blue light. The doctor said he would keep the limb, though the nerves would never be quite the same. To Kaelen, the phantom itch in his missing sensation was just another bill he had to pay. Lyra was there every morning. She didn't speak much. She mostly sat by the window, watching the city rebuild itself. The council had been purged, not by Kaelen's hand, but by the sheer weight of their own treachery. When the people of Aethelgard learned that their leaders had tried to sabotage their savior, the uprising had been swift and bloodless. Vaughn was in a detention cell, and Lyra was now the regent in all but name. "You're awake," she said softly, noticing his eyes opening on the fourth day. "Hard to sleep with all this peace and quiet," Kaelen croaked. "Give me a screaming engine room any day. At least I can yell back at it." Lyra walked over to the bed. She looked older. The events of the last week had etched lines of responsibility into her face that no royal cosmetic could hide. "The new council wants to see you, Kaelen. They want to offer you the seat of High Minister of Infrastructure. They want you to lead the planetary restoration." Kaelen looked at the ceiling. He felt the weight of the offer. It was everything he had ever been denied. Power, respect, a home. He could spend the rest of his life in this palace of light, eating real food and sleeping on beds that didn't smell like rust. He could be with Lyra. "Is that what they want?" Kaelen asked. "Or is that what you want?" Lyra hesitated. She reached out and touched his hand, his right hand, the one that still worked. "I want you to be happy, Kaelen. I want you to stay. I've lost you once. I don't think I can survive losing you a second time to the void." Kaelen looked at her, and his heart broke. He saw the future she was offering, a life of gold and silver, of holding her hand as they watched the suns rise over a perfect world. It was a beautiful dream, but it wasn't his. "I remember a story," Kaelen said, his voice quiet. "From when I was a kid on Xylos, there was this old scrapper who used to say that a wrench that never turns a bolt is just a fancy piece of paperweight. If I stay here, Lyra, I'll become a paperweight. I'll spend my days in meetings and my nights at banquets. I'll stop being the guy who hears the hum. I'll start being the guy who only hears the applause. You could do so much good here," she pleaded. "I've already done the good I was meant to do here," Kaelen said. And for the first time, there was no sarcasm in his voice. "I fixed the core. I fixed the council. But there are 1,000 other worlds out there, Lyra. Worlds that are falling apart. Worlds where the safe people have forgotten how to get their hands dirty. They don't need a high minister. They need a guy with a toolkit and a bad attitude." Lyra pulled her hand away, her ears drooping in a gesture of profound sadness. "You're leaving." "I have to," Kaelen said. "The universe is a big, broken machine, and I think I'm the only one who's got the right frequency tuner. If I stay in the Spire, I'm just hiding from the work. And the work is who I am." The humanistic theme had finally found its home in his chest. He understood now that his purpose wasn't tied to a location or a title. It was tied to the act of service, to the willingness to be the one who gets dirty so others can stay clean. He was accepting himself, flaws and all, as a servant of the machine, not a master of the palace. "I've prepped a ship," Lyra said after a long, painful silence. "The Sky Kite. It's a modified scout vessel. I had the engineers install a custom workshop and a coffee machine that actually makes that terrible human sludge you like." Kaelen felt a lump in his throat. "You're a class act, princess. You know that?" "I know," she said, her voice regaining some of its royal steel. "But if you ever break a bolt you can't fix, you know where to find me." The day of his departure was gray and misty, a rare occurrence on Aethelgard. Kaelen stood at the docking bay, his tool case back in his hand. He was wearing his old utility vest, patched and scorched, but familiar. His left arm was in a light sling, but he could already move the fingers. Lyra was there, along with Jackson and a few of the artificers. There were no speeches, no bands, just the low hum of the ship's engines warming up. "Kaelen," Jackson said, stepping forward. He handed Kaelen a small, crystalline shard. "It's a fragment of the old core. It's calibrated to your neural signature. If you're ever truly lost, it will hum." "Thanks, Gramps," Kaelen said, tucking the shard into a pocket. "Try not to let the kids break anything while I'm gone." He turned to Lyra. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and kissed him, a brief, bittersweet moment that tasted of ozone and tears. "Don't be a stranger, Voss," she whispered. "I'm a mechanic, Lyra," Kaelen said, stepping onto the ramp. "I always come back to check on my work." As the sky kite lifted off, Kaelen sat in the pilot's seat. He looked at the controls. They were a mess of Aethelgardian light tech and human analog switches, a bridge between two worlds. He felt the vibration of the engine through the seat, a low, steady purr that matched the rhythm of his own heart. He looked back one last time at the Onyx Spire, a needle of gold piercing the clouds. It was the most beautiful place in the galaxy, and he was leaving it behind. "All right, sweetheart," Kaelen said to the ship, his hands finding the familiar rhythm of the pre-flight check. "Let's see what's broken out there today." The transformation was complete. He wasn't the boy who lost his memory, and he wasn't the hero who saved a world. He was a man who had found his purpose in the struggle and his joy in the repair. He was Kaelen Voss, and he had work to do. The ship vanished into the slipstream, leaving Aethelgard behind. But as Kaelen looked out at the infinite expanse of stars, he didn't feel lonely. He felt connected, because in every star, in every ship, in every flickering light in the dark, he heard the hum, and as long as he could hear it, he knew he was home. The deep void of Sector 7 was a place where silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a physical weight. 3 weeks had passed since the sky kite slipped the gravitational leash of Aethelgard, and Kaelen Voss was finally starting to get used to the quiet. His left arm, though still tingling with the ghost fire of the pulse cutter, was functional enough to hold a soldering iron. In the cramped, oil-scented belly of his new ship, the golden halls of the Onyx Spire felt like a dream dreamed by someone else. "Talk to me, Kite," Kaelen murmured, tapping a flickering gauge on the console. "You've got a rattle in your secondary intake that's driving me up the wall." "Don't tell me you're getting homesick already." The ship didn't respond with words. Lyra's engineers had respected his request for a non-sentient interface. Nhung it hummed in a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through his boots. It was the same biocrystalline song as the Great Core, but humbler, tempered by the rugged steel and analog shunts Kaelen had spent the last fortnight installing. He was currently hovering near the wreckage of a mid-range freighter called the Rusty Bucket. It had been broadsided by a stray asteroid 6 hours ago, and its crew, a ragtag bunch of independent miners, were huddled in an emergency life pod with about 4 hours of air left. "Kaelen Voss to Bucket Life Pod," he said, clicking his comlink. "I'm in position. I'm going to try and slave your magnetic seal to my winch. It's going to be a bumpy ride, so try not to lose your lunch." "Copy that, Sky Kite," a gravelly voice responded. "We don't have much to offer for a rescue fee, friend. We're just hauling low-grade ore." Kaelen smiled, a real one that didn't hide behind a mask of sarcasm. "Don't sweat the small stuff, Captain. I don't take credits for breathing air. Just tell me you've got a pack of decent cigarettes or a story I haven't heard yet, and we'll call it even." As he maneuvered the ship, Kaelen felt the transformation in his own movements. He wasn't the frantic scavenger anymore, desperate to prove his worth by fixing things faster than everyone else. Nor was he the reluctant architect, burdened by the weight of a planet's destiny. He was a man who had accepted his place in the machinery of the universe. He was a bridge. He successfully latched the winch and began the slow trek toward the nearest trade outpost. While the automated systems handled the tow, Kaelen sat back in his chair and opened a small, battered metal box he'd kept in his pocket. Inside was the charred fragment of the sky kite toy Lyra had given him. He looked at the blackened metal. For 30 years, he had been running from the hole in his head where his memories used to be. He had treated his past like a broken engine, something to be feared or ignored. But now the hole was gone. The memories were there, but they didn't define him. The boy who had built the kite and the man who had saved the spire were just different versions of the same truth. Things break, and they can be fixed, but they never return to exactly the way they were. "The crack is where the light gets in," he whispered, quoting an old human proverb he'd heard on a transit station years ago. Back on Aethelgard, the aftermath was being processed in a very different way. In the Grand Archive, Jackson was overseeing the final calibration of the new, transparent governance system. The human factor was no longer a dirty secret to be suppressed. It was being integrated into the curriculum of every artificer. "He could have been a king," Jackson said to Lyra as they stood before the stabilized core. It was pulsing with a soft, steady gold, free of the violet rot. "He could have lived in the light forever." Lyra shook her head, a strand of silver hair falling over her shoulder. "No, Jackson. Aethelgard was his cradle, but the universe is his workshop. If he had stayed, he would have eventually started breaking things just so he had a reason to fix them again. He belongs to the dark places. That's where he finds his light." She looked at the small monitor on her wrist, tracking a tiny, faint signal that was moving slowly through Sector 7. It was a promise they had made. No calls, no diplomatic interference, just a persistent ping in the void to let her know he was still turning his wrench. "He found his purpose," Lyra said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "Most people spend 1,000 years and never get that close." Kaelen, meanwhile, was finishing the tow. He watched as the trade outpost's docking arms reached out to grab the rusty bucket. The miners were safe. Another machine stabilized. Another day of work completed. He stood up and stretched, his joints popping. He walked to the back of the ship, into the workshop Lyra had built for him. It was a mess already. Wires, scrap metal, and half-finished gadgets scattered across the benches. He picked up a heavy, well-worn wrench and weighed it in his hand. He felt the hum. It was faint here, far from the spire, but it was there. It was in the vibration of the deck plates, the hiss of the oxygen scrubbers, and the steady beat of his own heart. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the man who kept the world turning, one bolt at a time. The outpost was a bustling, gritty hub called Crossroads Station, a place where 3 different galactic sectors bled into one another. It smelled of recycled air, fried protein, and hope. Kaelen had spent 2 days there, refusing the miners' attempts to buy him drinks, and instead spending his time in the station's lower levels, helping the local engineers fix a stubborn water reclamation unit that had been failing for 3 years. He didn't ask for a title. He didn't tell them he had saved a princess or stabilized a planetary core. He just showed up with his toolkit, listened to the whine of the pumps, and told them their pressure valves were being little cowards. On the final evening, Kaelen sat at a small, grease-stained table in a corner canteen. He was eating a bowl of spicy noodles that actually made his eyes water, a sensation he vastly preferred over the bland, perfect nectar of the Onyx Spire. He pulled out his datapad and began drafting a message. He had promised Lyra he wouldn't be a stranger, but he struggled with the words. "Hey, princess, the food here is terrible and I love it." No, too blunt. "The stars look different from here." Too poetic. He finally settled on a single image, a photo of the water reclamation unit, now humming steadily with a makeshift copper shunt he'd forged himself. "Fixed a leak today," he wrote. "The water tastes like rust, but it's cold. Hope the core is behaving. Keep the light on for me." He hit send and felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He wasn't waiting for a miracle anymore. He was the miracle, in the most mundane, hard-working sense of the word. He stood up, slinging his toolkit over his shoulder. As he walked toward the docking bay, he saw a young girl sitting on a crate, crying over a broken mechanical bird. Its wings were bent, and its tiny internal gears were grinding with a sickening crunch. Kaelen stopped. The old Kaelen, the scavenger, might have walked past, preoccupied with his own survival. The architect might have ordered a drone to replace it, but the man he was now knelt down. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, his voice soft. "That's a nasty sound. Mind if I take a look? I'm a bit of a specialist when it comes to things that don't want to fly." The girl looked up, wiping her eyes. She handed him the toy. Kaelen pulled a small precision screwdriver from his vest, the one with the handle he'd carved from Aethelgardian stone. "You see this?" he said, showing her a tiny misaligned pin. "It's not broken. It's just lost its way. Sometimes even the smallest things need a little reminder of where they belong." With a deft flick of his wrist and a gentle tap, the gears clicked into place. The bird's wings fluttered, then began to glow with a soft, steady light. It let out a cheerful chirp and took flight, circling the girl's head. She laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that echoed through the dingy corridor. "Thank you, Mr. Mechanic." "Don't mention it," Kaelen said, standing up. "Just remember to keep the dust out of the joints. Machines are like people. They get grumpy if you don't pay attention to them." As he walked onto the ramp of the sky kite, Kaelen paused. He looked back at the station, a sprawling, chaotic mess of life and metal. He looked at his hands, scarred, stained, and steady. "I spent 30 years thinking that my life was a mistake, a series of broken parts that didn't fit any blueprint. I thought that if I could just find the right code, the right memory, I'd finally be whole. But standing here now, with the grease under my fingernails and the hum of the universe in my bones, I realize I was looking at it all wrong. Humanity isn't a finished product. We aren't built. We're grown, and then we're repaired, and then we're modified to survive the next storm. My scars aren't failures of the system. They're the upgrades I earned by staying in the fight. I'm not the architect who designed the world, and I'm not the boy who lost his way in it. I'm the bridge between the two. I've learned that a home isn't a palace or a station. It's the feeling you get when you realize you have something to give that no one else can. It's the moment you stop asking, why me, and start asking, where's the wrench? We all have a frequency we're tuned to, a specific way we're meant to help the big machine keep spinning. Some people are meant to lead and some are meant to follow, but me, I'm meant to fix. And in a universe as broken and beautiful as this one, that's the highest calling I can imagine. I've spent a lifetime learning that even the most shattered things can be put back together, though the seams will always show. I've realized that my value wasn't in my pedigree or my past, but in my willingness to get dirty for the sake of a stranger's light. I wonder, what is the broken part of your own life that you've been trying to hide or forget? What if that very flaw is actually the master key that allows you to help someone else who is struggling in the dark? Kaelen Voss turned the ignition, the sky kite roaring to life with a sound that was perfectly, beautifully imperfect. He didn't look back as he steered the ship into the infinite glowing sea of stars, already listening for the next hum that needed his help.